Welcome everyone. Thanks for being here for today's Healthy Farms, Healthy Agriculture Community Conversation on July 23rd, 2020. We've designed these community conversation web meetings to allow a somewhat informal discussion of a topic and foster participation among the attendees. At the end of today's meeting, we will give you an overview of the site where these conversations can continue. It's an asynchronous forum hosted by Connect Extension. Earlier this month, on July 14th, we held the first cross-pollinating biosecurity community conversation. We discussed what agricultural biosecurity means and how it plays out in support of plant, animal, and human health. Today's conversation is designed to turn our thinking to considering incentives for action, both positive and negative, carrots and sticks, that may be necessary when private cost-benefit calculations do not align with community-wide or public cost-benefit analyses. Before introducing today's featured speaker, I want to introduce myself and the co-organizer of the Cross-Pollinating Biosecurity Community Conversations. I'm Dr. Julie Smith, Research Associate Professor at the University of Vermont. Since 2002, I have been engaged with preventative animal health programs, biosecurity education, and agricultural emergency preparedness, especially preparedness related to animal emergency diseases. For the last 5 years, I've been the project director of a large multidisciplinary project with a multi-institutional team. The team has applied social science, human decision-making, economics, and animal health perspectives to solving an agricultural problem. How do we do a better job through communication, policy, and incentives of making sure people are doing their best to ensure that new diseases do not enter or spread within production systems? We think our approaches and what we have learned are applicable across agriculture, including crop and plant production systems. We now have a public-facing website called Healthy Farms, Healthy Agriculture, which provides access to resources on preventing, detecting, and responding to health threats of animals, including training and planning resources. We hope to secure additional funding to expand our resources to be inclusive of plant and crop protection as well. And I do want to note that Joanna Cummings has been largely responsible for getting that website set up and for getting our forums set up. If you want to know more about the overall project activities, I encourage you to take a look and have a listen to presentations that were given at our symposium in May of 2019. You can find them at https://agbiosecurityproject.org. At that meeting, we intentionally invited stakeholders with plant and crop interests, and Deb Grantham, director of the Northeastern Integrated Pest Management Center, was one of those who took us up on the invitation. She attended the project symposium and workshop, and since then has been instrumental in arranging for cross-pollination between my project and the IPM community. And she's been instrumental in setting up this month's cross-pollinating community conversations. So I'd like to give her a chance to introduce herself and a bit about the objectives for today's meeting. Deb?
Thanks, Julie. Thanks very much. I'm very excited to be part of this discussion. I see great value in cross-disciplinary interaction, and we'll see some of that today. One of the things I noted last time that we met was that many of the terms we use are different across disciplines, but the goals of managing pests and diseases of plants, animals, and humans, and the concepts in our approaches to those goals are very similar. Last week we had a very interesting conversation about that concept, and I think quite a few participants started thinking about biosecurity and integrated pest management through a more comprehensive lens. I hope to see more of that and look forward to our discussion today. Thanks.
That's fantastic. So we're gonna move on to the next question I have for you that I'd like to hear your answers about in the chat. So some of you got to do this last time, so I'm asking you again. Deb and I have our own thoughts about why you should be part of this community, but we're curious about what brought you here today. So go ahead and type in the chat box what you are hoping to accomplish by joining our conversation today. What do you hope to get out of being part of today's conversation? No matter what brought you here today, we're glad to have you along for this community conversation. Today, we'll take a look at some economic concepts that are important to consider when designing policies to promote behaviors with broad benefits. We also want to pique your interest in continuing to share challenges and solutions with others like yourself who are engaged in motivating action to protect plant, animal, or human health and sustain health globally. Before we end today's session, we'll show you how to find our biosecurity community subgroup and forums in Connect Extension. It is a real pleasure to introduce you to one of the collaborators on my current biosecurity project, Glynn Tonsor, agricultural economist with Kansas State University, which happens to be where he attained his PhD, has been studying producer, market, and consumer perceptions and anticipated behaviors in a range of contexts. Not one to shy away from controversial topics, he has published findings relevant to animal welfare, animal identification, and emergency animal disease response. Glynn, welcome to today's cross-pollinating biosecurity community conversation.
Well, thank you for that, Julie.
Glynn, I know you are prepared to share a few key points with the attendees and stimulate some discussion. And I want the audience to know that they can enter questions in the chat box at any time. And if anyone would rather speak than type a question, simply type hand in the chat box. And I'm going to throw another question your way, Glynn, before you start. I'm curious what you hope to achieve through today's conversation.
Yeah, so it's a good question. And my answer to that would be similar to when I, pre-COVID, would make a trip to DC and attempt to share some insights to improve, hopefully, a decision. What I hope here is to share some insights that are certainly grounded in economic thought, because I'm an economist, of how to approach an issue, maybe to raise our appreciation of the conflicting incentives that producer A and producer B, or producer A and government A might have, to just recognize the challenges of all these situations, and maybe impress on us that while we can never solve and fully align those at time conflicting incentives, there are ways to get them closer and more aligned. So in many ways, I am of the opinion that there's always ways to improve, whether it is how the hog industry works, how it is a university works, or whatever. And I hope to improve how we think about these issues, and therefore hopefully society improves as well. I'm not so naive to think things are black and white and we're going to solve the problem in one lunch discussion, but I do think the notion of nudging us towards improvement is something we can all agree on, and that's what I hope to get out of this.
Thanks, Glynn. We're looking forward to your remarks, and you have the floor along with discussion until 20 of the hour.
Beautiful. All right, beautiful. Now everybody should be seeing my screen. Can you confirm that, Julie? Yes, very good. Deb's nodding her head, so I presume we are good. Beautiful. So I'm going to be fairly high level, 30,000 foot level in my remarks here, because I just want to kind of set the stage of how I think about this challenge. And I have a non-fancy title here. It's really just a discussion about livestock biosecurity issues, and I'm going to try to tie it into where I think there's commonality with plants is really my goal here. Julie's already made a comment about the grant that's behind this. I just include this to be complete. So thanks for this grant, for being part of the reason we're here today. And then I want to kick this discussion off actually with one of my colleagues, and Julie highlighted this paper. I've read it in the past, and I did review it again in advance of this session. For those of you who don't know him, Anton Beckerman is now a former faculty member at Montana State. He's an ag economist, roughly my same stage of career, got his PhD at NC State, and he actually recently has moved into administration. So those of you from the northeast part of the country may run into him in the future. He's joined the administration at the University of New Hampshire. This summer, that transition is underway for Anton. So it's a plug. Some of you might see him in your other networks, to the point these things build networks, to keep that in mind. But he published, along with some other co-authors, a paper back in 2012 that I think is useful because it was framed in the plant realm, but almost every economic point and concept point they talk about holds in the livestock realm. And I think appreciating that common spillover is important. So I want to quickly kind of summarize and limit my jargon in doing so, what Anton and his co-authors did in this paper. And basically what they highlight is that, there's a lot of common issues around disease mitigation that we can all appreciate. And when you have an adverse event, In this case, think a weather event that hurts a crop, okay? Well, not surprising, you can have a massive production hit. Subsequently, that production disruption can have a major effect on the ag markets, which is where the livelihood of the producers come into play and others that are relying on those volumes for additional processing. And depending on the commodity and the scale of that commodity in a given country, or if they're a major exporter to others that are dependent on imports, you can have actually a food security component. So it's not just an ag sector. It's not just something producers care about. It quickly can become a societal issue. And that's why we care a lot about these diseases in a broader sense. At the same time, they highlight that private efforts are costly. So almost any potential disease, there are ways to mitigate the risk, but very, very rarely are any of those free. There's always something else you could do with those dollars or time and effort. So you've got to prioritize. So private efforts are costly. That's the reason we don't protect fully against all risk. That's the reason some of us partially cover our cars, not fully cover our cars with car insurance and so forth. There's a lot of those common logics. At the same time, economists approach things from a benefit cost perspective. So it's not sufficient just to talk about the cost. We've got to think of the benefits of these things. And unfortunately, when it comes to disease mitigation, often an individual person, so in this case, think a row crop farmer in the Midwest, their efforts to mitigate a crop disease are not fully observable. And the net benefit of that sometimes doesn't even exist. So for example, if you don't have a plant disease come into the state of Illinois, well, there's not a big benefit to that individual producer of investing in something to protect against it that year because it never showed up. So at times there's an absent benefit, and that sort of justifies in the eyes of producers sometimes why they don't make those costly investments. Moreover, oftentimes there's this complementary effect that if I do something as a producer, but the neighbors around me don't sort of match it, then the efficacy of my effort is quickly goes away. And in the case of livestock, if I'm one of 10 hog barn owners and I put in things to kind of protect my barns from, say, ASF, but the 9 people around me don't, that obviously is going to impact my risk of getting ASF. So there's a collective benefit of kind of jointly tackling the problem that I think we recognize, but we can't forget. Now, this particular paper that Anton was leading was framed around the issue about wind-borne diseases, and specifically framed to the production of soybeans in the US. Most of you probably know corn and soybeans are major commodities for a good chunk of the states in the middle of the Midwest of our country, and is the foundation of livestock feed, by the way, to connect this back to the livestock sector. So we have lots of similarities to livestock and human diseases that I hope you appreciate. This is framed around soybeans. From my perspective, everything I've said so far could equally apply to the hog sector dealing with African swine fever. And honestly, some of them could even apply to COVID-19 and human disease issues. So I encourage us to recognize that. This particular paper also notes that a producer-funded checkoff might be helpful. Specifically, what they propose is each soybean producer would contribute monetarily to an industry fund, and some of those funds would be set aside and be available to cover indemnity in the event a producer has, in this case, a wind-borne disease event. The intent of that, and the reason that's appealing, is industry collectively self-helping and not being reliant on public funds has a lot of economic benefits, which are nice. But some of the transition of that into reality can fall apart pretty quick. So it sounds good in academic papers, and in times it's pragmatic, and other times it's a challenge. And here's some distinctions I think do exist between the crop sector and at least currently, the U.S. livestock sector. And first and foremost, we have to recognize we already have checkoff programs in several commodities, both on crops and livestock. And some of those are most contentious in the livestock sector, particularly the beef cattle sector. Pretty much a never-ending series of lawsuits around the legal standing and the ability to use funds around mandatory collected funds from producers is already in place. So the ability to do more of that, add to that, increase the checkoff collections as a mechanism to fund a self-help indemnity program, I think is a challenge in the U.S. livestock sector, and may not be quite as much of a challenge in some of the plant space if they don't have the same history of contention around existing checkoffs. The other part that I'll highlight here is it takes a certain mentality for an industry to collectively have a checkoff program where they're collectively putting money in a fund that think about it as it's an insurance fund for their own industry. You sort of have to recognize an issue and jointly say, if we do this together, we're all going to be better off. There's a mindset that most producers have to kind of jointly share in order for that to work. And in the current environment in the beef industry and to a certain extent the pork industry, there's a lot of debates within the vertically connected industry about whether or not we're all really in it together or not. Strife between individual producers and those that buy their livestock, or strife between packers and those that buy their meat products is what I'm alluding to. And if you have that mental challenge already on some just price relationships and issues that have been elevated by COVID, by the way, then it's going to make it harder for some of these things to be implemented in the livestock sector. So to put a bow on this, the academic economic argument is self-funded, aligning interests to kind of pay ourselves when we need to, makes a lot of sense in an academic sense. Transitioning into reality can be a challenge, and the ability to do that is probably industry specific. But one of the key points here is externalities will always exist. So what I mean by an externality is if I am a livestock producer and I'm concerned about African swine fever, that's one thing. But it's very hard for me to be sufficiently concerned to recognize the full impact African swine fever has on the entire industry. I might make investment and take action that aligns with my personal benefits of that, but I'm probably not going to take action and effort and investment that aligns with social. So whether that's industry-wide or a USDA perspective or even a domestic food security perspective, it's very hard for an individual producer to internalize all those things. Economists call those externalities, and that is not unique to the livestock sector. You'd have the exact same thing on the plant space. So these externalities will always exist, and I'm not sure it's bad they do exist because we need different market signals and incentives, but I think there are ways to nudge people to internalize more of them, and we can talk about that in our Q&A. Secondly, I do think there's ways that livestock and plant producers can have action be targeted that not only gives them private benefit cost things that are appealing, but might nudge their action towards a broader kind of social goal. Again, whether it's industry or USDA type goal. And two specific things I have in mind here. One of them is around the notion of indemnity programs. So this ties into Beckerman's work, but it also ties into the grant that Julie alluded to as partially supporting this effort. Lee Schultz is a colleague of mine at Iowa State. We've, throughout this grant, worked on various aspects of this question. And one of the key things we have found and documented in various ways is that U.S. swine producers will actually implement more biosecurity effort, investment, compliance if they believe their indemnity from the federal government is conditioned on their effort. And what I mean by that is if you're going to get, let's say, full indemnity check, if you can document you were trying to protect yourself, if you can document you had clean barns, those kind of things, and if you truly believe that you're going to get a partial check or no check if you can't document that good faith effort, then not surprisingly, you have larger effort on the biosecurity front. Why am I bringing that up? This is a way to potentially have public's role be targeted. Some of you probably know in the general press, there's more and more commentary about COVID stimulus funds. Should they be targeted towards building the U.S. infrastructure? Should they be targeted towards building a green energy base? Should they be targeted to, you pick your social goal? All these things are relevant. In the space of diseases, they could also happen as well. But one could target cost shares. And what I mean by cost share, in the livestock space, maybe we could use more truck washes, more air filtration, more, you pick it. There's lots of things you can do to mitigate disease risk. And you can partially build an argument that maybe that should be partially paid by an individual producer and partially paid by, let's say, the federal government if it serves a greater social good. Well, at face value, that makes sense. But I would encourage us to think about those cost share programs being different based upon the efficacy and the externalities that each producer faces. All else equal, the bigger the social benefit of those efforts, the bigger the cost share as paid by the government should be. The less of a social benefit there is, then the economist is going to say less should be paid by the taxpayer. That's not anything new, but we need to recognize that and appreciate that when we're trying to give advice and guidance on how to make use of our resources. Third thing I want to note here, because my opinion is it applies across other sectors, is some of the stuff that, again, Lee and I found out of this particular grant was that livestock producer biosecurity effort is more responsive to a 1% change in the cost. What does it cost them to do something then a parallel gain in the disease risk mitigation. So I'll say this again, make sure we're being clear. Reducing cost is more effective than improving the disease mitigation, even if it's the same percentage gain. Why is this relevant? I think it's important that we appreciate there's a lot of alternative policies, a lot of alternative disease mitigation efforts that could be pursued. And you have to make research and development interest early to decide which ones to pursue. And I would encourage us as society, and I think this holds over to plants as well, to not forget the simple basic point that producers are very price and cost sensitive. And when we're trying to decide which efforts to push or which ones to subsidize or which ones to further develop in the R&D pipeline, having an eye towards making them cheaper to implement at times actually might be more effective than coming up with a new high fancy bells and whistles tool that is around the spirit of let's do something more efficient in reducing the risk. In other words, if people respect the cost more, you don't need a fancy tool if it's partially effective, but a lot more people adopt it. And I encourage us to think about that. For my fellow academics, you're probably aware of what we call the null bias in publishing work, at least in Ag Econ. If you try to publish a paper where you run a model and your coefficients are not statistically significant, i.e. you don't find statistical evidence of a negative or a positive effect, that's a challenge because sometimes finding no effect and documenting it has real important points. And, my discipline can be accused of, having a look out, having an interest in what's new, hot, and sexy in the statistical realm and maybe misses out on real world relevance at times because of that. Same notion holds here. I'd encourage us to keep an eye out towards things that are cost efficient, even if they aren't new and fancy. They can be pretty useful. And then fourth here, this is a COVID related point, but I think it's important given the broader environment we're all in. Adverse experiences like a human pandemic that disrupts production, supply chain activities, so forth, can have some offsetting impacts, and they can be conflicting on how the production chain responds. On one hand, this is bad for biosecurity investment and compliance effort, because if you have, whether it's a soybean producer or a swine producer, if their profit margin's being squeezed and they're having tough discussions with their lender, it gets hard to justify additional investment or to put in a barn that has the extra thing like air filtration and other stuff with it. That argument becomes a little harder in an arena where the profit margins are being squeezed. It still might be appealing in some sense, but it gets harder in that environment just because our overall profitability is squeezed. Conversely, when you're in an era of these adverse experiences and the public sector has a big role, and we're doing that with all society in the form of unemployment boost, we're doing it in the form of CARES Act by giving, compensation to livestock and crop producers in various ways. So the government is involved in more ways during these adverse events. There is an opportunity in that to make those funds conditional and targeted. And again, I'll tie back to the example of there's a lot of calls push towards green energy in the spirit of mitigating greenhouse gases and climate change. We're not having a climate change discussion here today, but it's the exact same economic argument logic that if the public government is going to send funds to an industry, potentially they should be a little more targeted to not just help that industry, but help it move towards a broader goal. And I think there's room for both plant and livestock diseases to be approached the same way when we talk about public funding of private effort. That's my last slide here, Julie. Thank you everybody for plowing through this. I'm not sure exactly how this is going to go from here, but while I have the screen share, at K-State we have a website called agmanager.info. I've highlighted my own main page where stuff is cross-tabbed from there. I'm noting this because half a dozen of the things I've alluded to here today, there's other fact sheets and journal articles and webinars and all that kind of stuff is cross-linked from that page. If it's of interest to you, I encourage you to make use of it.
We certainly welcome discussion, whether people have thoughts in the chat box or want to unmute and share. Scott, would you like to share a comment or question?
Yes. Glynn, I'm
Hi, Scott.
by you. Can you hear me?
I can.
So I was curious if you could just talk a little about the overall kind of ideas about this free rider effect and going into that a little more and how you're seeing that relate to potentially indemnity and some of those.
Sure. So I'm going to use the swine industry example because that's in my wheelhouse, but I think it applies to others. a fourth of U.S. pork production is normally exported. And there's a perpetual risk that if we have a disease event, we're going to lose access to a certain country. And I'll just pick on Japan just to make my point, but it's not specific to Japan. Japan is a major importer of U.S. pork products. There's a real risk that if we have a disease event for at least some period of time, they may stop importing U.S. pork. Why am I giving you that specific example here? It could only take one outbreak on one operation and be small and still have that loss of market, which would hit the pocketbook of the entire swine industry. So potentially a disease event on one operation would be sufficient to knock that out. The issue with that is it's very hard for every individual swine producer to make the investment necessary, quote unquote necessary, to get that risk to zero, because you can't get down to zero. So you've got this misalignment where the economic impact of losing an aggregate market access is way greater than the personal benefit any one producer would have. That disconnect is just prevalent in all these discussions. And it leads to partial adoption, partial implementation, and frustration by those that are wanting more implementation. I mean, that's sort of always the case in these stories. I think you could do the exact same thing with, soybean rust and the ability to export soybean. I mean, there's a lot of things here where sometimes it's just a production disruption. Sometimes it's a loss of an export market. Those economic signals back to the producer rarely align perfectly with the total aggregate cost. Another component of the free rider that I'll highlight, to hone in on even like a smaller nugget of your question, Scott, is if I was very, very smart, connected, and trusting of all my fellow swine producers, I would give lots of cheap talk and encourage all of them to invest massively to mitigate disease and then not spend a single dollar myself. So what I mean by that is I would not spend a dollar towards it. I would internalize all the benefits of all my neighbors mitigating disease risk around me, and I get the net benefit because I get, quote unquote, the same livestock price without increasing my expenses, while everybody around me is bearing the cost of preventing the disease. That's the free rider challenge at the extreme, right? And that's an extreme where you only got one person not doing it, but you get the point. In every county in our country, you've got versions of that going on. I don't want to make it political, but you could even have the exact same discussion around COVID and mask, right? There's individuals that are free riding on others. If you're in a group of 30 and 29 are wearing masks and one isn't, the one that isn't implicitly is doing some free riding on the other 29. So there's lots of examples like that that hold that aren't just economics. So I hope that helps, Scott.
And there's a question for a little more the definition of what the free rider effect is. Is that related to capitalizing on the prisoner's dilemma?
That would be one way to think about it. But I mean, I want to take us down to seventh grader that I have in this household level logic to make sure we're all on the same page. Is go back to my swine producer example. If I can get a constant hog price, but not invest more, I'm going to benefit if everybody around me is making an expensive investment. They are bearing that cost and their profits are being squeezed because of that. But I'm benefiting because my odds of the industry still sending the pork to Japan and supporting my sales price is something I internalize. So the free rider benefit is I'm benefiting by the actions of those around me without putting money, sweat, effort on the table. That's why I give that example the way I did. In reality, there's a whole continuum of free riding. So I think everybody on here knows it's not just one biosecurity practice. There's a whole suite of things you could be doing. And there's probably some operation out there that's doing 15 things, right? And there's a whole bunch of them out there that are doing 5 and some that are doing none and so forth. Even those that are doing 5 are partially free riding on those that are doing 15. Mm-hmm. So there's really a whole continuum here where the effort of those around me is partially benefiting me, but I'm not paying for it, that we need to recognize.
Glynn, can I follow up a little on that?
Yeah.
I heard Lee talk a couple of days ago, and I was really excited to hear some of his work on linking biosecurity efforts to indemnity. And that was for African swine fever or tier 1 disease is more that discussion. But I was wondering if we could open that discussion to other things that might have some insurance applications or indemnity applications for linking biosecurity efforts to get rid of some of that free rider kind of behavior.
Yep. So let me give a quick context on where that came from for our listeners, and then we can maybe even have somebody chime in with a plant application would be helpful here. So back in 2015, we had the high path experience. So Iowa and Minnesota in particular had a fair number of federally, depopulation efforts going on, and you had large expense at the federal taxpayer to those producers. That was part of the effort to kind of stamp out the disease, respond to the disease, so forth. What was documented in that effort was some of those producers had good faith, good biosecurity, and still had the disease, right? And that happens. That's not fun, but they were doing the best they could, and they had a reasonably clean barn, but still got the disease. Other producers had more of a lax approach and maybe hadn't cleaned their barn in 3 or 5 years. So both producers initially got very similar indemnity, and to boot, the federal government had a much more expensive cleanup process when they went into a barn that had been cleaned for 3 or 5 years. So the federal government learned the cost of responding is different if I go onto an operation that has been doing more, is active compliant than others, right? They recognize this, and frankly, they hit a budget wall. They had to go to Congress to get more funds. So that motivated some of this discussion. Fast forward from that observation, Leah and I encouraged and have found it would be helpful to make indemnity more generally just conditioned on proof of good effort. Maybe folks like Julie and others would sign off on a list of practices that we think help mitigate disease, and you need to prove that you've got 3 of the 10 or 7 of the 10 or whatever. You can think checklist to kind of prove you're doing something to be eligible for a full indemnity check. That's the logic there. You can do the same thing on insurance in other ways. The problem, though, you're never going to fully internalize it because there's a perpetual political risk. And I'm not trying to make everything political, it's just reality when you're talking private and public funding, is those alignments will work until a political group decides we're going to cut equal indemnity checks regardless of what you're doing, because in the heat of the moment during an adverse event, that is the politically desirable outcome. Because it takes political will to cut a check that's a larger amount to one producer than a different producer, not based upon size or income thresholds, but based upon biosecurity effort. I mean, you're asking political officials to own that distinction. And the economist in me tells you that that's far from certain that's going to happen. And therefore, the net gain of this falls apart if the political will isn't there to actually enforce the conditionality of the indemnity policy. So I hope that makes sense. We could think through how to do that on insurance and how to do it on, crop insurance of soybeans. I mean, you could come through certain ways to change the subsidy rate. Most of corn and soybeans in this country have a federally subsidized crop insurance program behind them. You could complicate that subsidy, and the subsidy is greater if you prove you're doing more to prevent a plant disease, but it'll fall apart if there's not political will to truly make the subsidy different at the end of the day.
Some big things to think about there. I'm wondering if anyone engaged in IPM has run into any situations like that, any situations where you feel the incentives aren't aligned in a way that is most helpful for getting the actions that would be ideal for dealing with whatever pest you're after. So Joanna has a question, and this is wide open to anyone. So I think it's relevant to folks in the IPM community as well as maybe Glynn has some thoughts. So Joanna's question is, how can small producers be motivated or incentivized to practice biosecurity? Because they fall at the end of the spectrum you were talking about, Glynn, where the foreign markets don't really matter to them.
Right.
So would there be a special subsidy needed, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you could talk about subsidy in the space that there are a lot of things in U.S. ag where small producers get quote unquote preferential treatment. And the simplest example is if you're a large producer, your payment caps come into play. So the subsidy effectively is lower per hog or per acre. So there's already some of that in place, and you could make that stronger. I mean, there's ways to prioritize small or redefine small to shift more funds that way. What comes to my mind instead, though, actually, from a livestock perspective, and we can talk through a row crop, is the smaller you are, the more likely you are to truly be a price taker and not be in position to kind of negotiate the terms of a contract and just take the price of the day and the terms of the day, because you don't have the ability to push back, so to speak, if you're truly small. Why am I highlighting that? Is an internal industry, so no longer a public USDA type approach, maybe within the industry. If it was deemed that having additional disease mitigation effort would serve the industry well, you could have those specs be part of what I call grids. So in the US cattle industry, for example, it's fairly common when you sell an animal to go from live animal to harvest. So the last step of fed cattle when it leaves a feed yard, you can sell it on what's called the grid, and you're paid differently based upon, you know, the dressed weight, so what it weighs relative to water weight and so forth. But you're also paid more if it's CAB eligible, or if it's prime instead of select, and so forth. There's a growing list over time of those price differentiations occurring. So the grid is a schedule of premiums and discounts that if your cattle are eligible for this, you get a higher check. And if they're not favorably aligned with that grid, you get hammered, right? Carrots and sticks is the point. You can envision a world where biosecurity effort is on that list. PQA is on that list. It doesn't garner a much different price yet, but it's on the list. And one could think through secure pork supply could be on that list, which captures some of these things. So it's not just the federal government. You could have industry inner workings that send those signals. And in many ways, they might actually nudge a smaller, medium-sized producer more because they sort of have to accept those terms of a contract more than others.
So we have some questions that we want to engage the participants with, and we're going to start entering them in the chat. And if you want to respond in the chat, please put the number of the question that you're responding to at the start of your response. And you can respond in whatever order you want. Like we might have 5 questions there and you're like, oh, I have a response to question 1. Just put a 1 at the beginning of your response. And I think what we're just talking about is very related to our first question, which is, in what ways has what you heard today changed how you think about getting people to do things that protect the health of plants or animals or people? How has what you heard today changed how you think about doing that? So I'm hoping that we've stimulated your thinking, that there's something that's connected with you that you're like, oh, well, what if we could do this? Or
So
how that works.
Julie, while they're doing that, and I have the liberty to add another observation, I'll share this because I think it applies to crops as well as livestock.
Sure.
It is pre-COVID, it was well documented. There was kind of, I call it a protectionistic move. Questioning globalization and so forth was here before COVID. And in many ways, COVID is put on steroids, that line of thinking. At the same time, many aspects of the U.S. ag sector, commercial sector, have grown more dependent on exports over the last 20 years. That in itself is a challenge because if you have a heavy percentage of beef, pork, soybeans, corn that are being produced and being exported, the domestic taxpayer and consumer partially internalizes the food security argument and therefore partially will justify public subsidies and investments compared to a past world where we consume more of those things at home. So we're in this weird kind of potential shift point where the industries over time have been growing because there's comparative advantage in producing corn, soybeans, pork, so forth here in the US. Other countries want to import it. That's been going on for a while. And now we have this kind of political winds are pushing against that. It's interesting to think through what that might do from a broader taxpayer perspective on the willingness to do some of these subsidizing efforts, because it changes the notion that they internalize it from a food security perspective.
Thanks, Glynn. We're going to go ahead and put up questions 2 and 3 because some of you have seen them before, and I'm just curious if new things have come to mind. Our second question is, what challenges do you and your peers face in getting others to adopt practices that support plant and animal health? And our third question is, which challenges, so referring to the challenges that we face in getting people to take up our recommendations, what challenges do you feel are common among those protecting plant and animal, including human health? The reason why we ask this question, maybe I'm leading your thinking a little bit, but the reason why we ask that question is to see if we can identify common challenges that might have common solutions. So maybe we identify that we would like more training, more information about communication strategies that are effective. So that could be a shared approach to solving a problem that we face. And while on that line, we can go ahead and put question 4 in there. Question 4 is, what training or resources would help you address these challenges? And part of my thinking that's been stimulated this week is to think about, do we think that it's science that's the problem? Do we need more facts? Or is it social science that we need more of? Do we need more tools in our toolbox for convincing people to do something different, to help someone change behavior, to help change policies, to make it more likely for someone to adopt a practice or behavior that we think is most helpful for supporting crop and animal production, for supporting human health? And now I'm going to have our 5th question put in there, and I'm hoping to get some responses, especially to question 5 today. So question 5 is, in what ways do you share your experiences, such as success stories and lessons learned, with others? So some of you may be part of a project where you have to report your outputs and your outcomes, and I'm curious how you do that. In some extension organizations, we talk about sharing success stories. And so I'm curious how you share those and whether you feel they're being shared effectively. Do you feel like we're sharing these stories with the right people? I think sometimes we get caught up in doing our reporting to satisfy the bean counters and maybe to ensure that we get more funding in the future. But are we sharing success stories that might be helpful in helping others do more of what we're trying to get done in a community? Are we doing a good job of sharing those stories with the communities that we work with? Do you host web meetings? Do you have discussion groups? Do you have field days? You know, what are ways that people are sharing what they're doing and possibly encouraging others to adopt practices that are new to them? Great, so there's some comments coming in. I'm going to go ahead and ask Joanna to start sharing her screen, and we're going to walk you over to the forums and Connect extension. And this is where we have our Healthy Farms Biosecurity Community Forum currently. So we had originally developed it on our own site, but then we found that the extension had set up this this feature within Connect extension, and it's really great. And there's a lot of folks who are already members of Connect extension. What I like about a forum for sharing, exchanging information among people like ourselves, so people who are either involved with generating information or with sharing information with others that we're hoping will adopt practices, working with people on the ground who are doing the work of keeping plants healthy, keeping pests out of buildings, keeping people healthy. I like a forum because whatever topic you're responding to stays there, and the responses and the reply thread is right there. You can go back to it and refer to it and find it relatively easily. Whereas if you're on a listserv, at least my experience has been that messages coming in the listserv get lost. They go into that folder and they're buried in that folder, and it can be challenging to search or even remember that there was something interesting in that folder to look at. So I don't know how many of you have participated in a forum, or maybe like a group in LinkedIn or a Facebook group or something like that. The idea here is to have a perpetual conversation that's organized by topic. And all you have to do is register for an account with Connect extension, and then look for the Healthy Farms Biosecurity subgroup. So this section is considered a subgroup of the whole site. And I want you to know that this forum belongs to all of the members. This isn't my forum. It's not Joanna's forum. It's not Deb's forum. It's every member's forum. So if members have ideas for new forums, new topics, want to add different ways of contributing to the conversation, you know, maybe you're like, oh, if you're not seeing a way to post a link to a video or whatever, you ask us. And if we don't have that feature turned on, we may be able to get it for you. We hope that participating in forums like this will provide value, that by interacting with others in the community, that you'll have access potentially to additional expert resources, additional opportunities to collaborate, and encouragement, sharing your challenges with others and maybe getting some support back saying, yep, I faced the same challenge, just keep at it. Or, oh, why don't you try this? Maybe you'll get some helpful feedback along the way. Also, when you join, you can set notifications. So the Connect extension is getting really big and there's a lot going on. So you may want to limit how much is coming in your inbox from Connect extension. You can do that by modifying your personal notification settings. I also want to mention that this forum is being observed. So at this time, we have a informed consent section that's describing what information we're collecting and how that's being used. There's a grad student, Danielle Farley, at the University of Montana, who's working with her supervisor, Joel Iverson, to monitor how people are sharing in this biosecurity community. So she's taking aggregated information. She's not sharing people's names, things like that. But we're hoping to demonstrate the value of this kind of community to folks who are working in the area of protecting plant health, animal health, dealing with pests, that sort of thing. So just going back, just a reminder, there's 2 steps to join the forums. You need to first enroll in Connect extension and get a user ID, and then you can join. You select to join the Healthy Farms Biosecurity Community Subgroup, and that's a pretty simple process. So we'll be adding topics to the forum based on our conversation today. We will be editing this video before it is posted, so it will be there for folks to go back to. And I'm going to pull up a poll as we close out. So our final poll is to have you just provide feedback. You can select as many of these as apply to you in terms of ways that you might interact with a forum. Would you be sharing a story from your own experience? Would you be looking for stories from others' experience? Would you be looking for technical assistance? Would you be hoping to learn more about topics of interest, or just to be part of a community? So let us know there. And we are actually just over time. I've been not doing my job of monitoring the time, but I want to thank you all again for joining us today. And I hope that you'll join me in thanking our featured speaker today, Glynn. Thanks so much for being here. There's a link to a feedback form about our community conversation that you can find. It's on the slide and it will be in the chat box. We appreciate you taking a few moments to share your thoughts with us. And I just want to give you an invitation, if you are engaged at all in youth agriculture, working with young people engaged in agriculture, we're going to be hosting some biosecurity web meetings this fall that are related to youth biosecurity education. So if you have ideas for topics or speakers for those community conversations, please be in touch. Again, thank you for joining this Healthy Farms, Healthy Agriculture community conversation. And as we go back to our worlds today, I hope that we're not just thinking about biosecurity of plants and animals, but how we are doing our part to slow the spread of COVID-19. So until next time, be well and biosecure.